Welcome, everyone, to our seminar on the foundations of grounded normative theory. We have four excellent contributions, or three and a half an excellent contribution, just to be modest. And I'm really looking forward to sharing the conversation with each other. So I think we're just going to jump right in. So first, Sung Moon, what's going to happen is we will do sort of a round robin of commentary, so as to introduce you to each of the papers that we have circulated them in advance. And then we'll, hopefully by doing it that way, leave lots of time for conversation. So welcome. I'm Brooke Ackerley. I have Sung Moon Kim from City of Hong Kong University, Peggy Cohn of Toronto University, and Paul Apostolitis from LSE. And we're just delighted to have everybody together today. Sung Moon.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Brooke, for inviting me to this very exciting panel. So I'm commenting on Peggy's paper and have several questions on the paper as well toward the end of my presentation here. So in her contribution, Peggy presents William James and John Dewey as uncredited or hidden originators of what we now in this workshop call grounded normative political theory, a set of political theories that are oriented toward social change and embedded in existing normative orders. In reference to James and Dewey's philosophical writings, Peggy identifies the key features of grounded normative theory in several terms. First, it involves pluralistic and intersubjective moral reasoning. According to this view, moral judgment begins by acknowledging the plural character of human beings, the environment, and the varied forms of life that emerge through interactions over time. And this makes it impossible to arrive at moral truth without engaging with others. Second, and relatedly, grounded normative theory, or GNT, is anti-foundationalist in the sense that it does not posit the existence of a pre-political or antecedent truth that is located outside of human deliberation, discussion, and contestation. This essentially, I don't think this is a proper word here, but this essentially discursive nature of GNT makes it intersubjective, inclusive, and process-dependent, defying the existence of any pre-political webs of meaning. Third, despite rejecting the antecedent truth, GNT still believes in the possibility of moral truth and judgment through a Deweyan pragmatist inquiry in its specific sense and problem solving. Fourth, as a participatory, discursive, and pluralist social inquiry, GNT understands moral truth and ethical ideas in terms of an inclusive process of social struggles, at the center of which lies the empowerment of the people at the margin of society. This makes the people's ability of a social critic as moral agents an indispensable method to inquire about moral truth. Fifth, finally, as such, GNT fundamentally challenges the fact-value distinction. Rather, it understands them as mutually constitutive. From the perspective of GNT, for instance, the Rawlsian idea of the veil of ignorance is a fantastical idea, fundamentally at odds with the pragmatist insight that the foundational principles can only be evaluated from the distinctive perspectives produced through experience. Okay, I strongly agree with nearly everything Peggy had to say about the core characteristics of GNT and its connection with the American pragmatism. Peggy helps us see deeper philosophical reasons to support GNT when the field of normative political theory is increasingly dominated by those who still believe in the special moral standing of the philosopher who understands the central task of normative theory in terms of moral justification by the standard of objective truth. I just have several questions for Peggy's clarification and further consideration, especially from comparative perspective. First, although we can learn from Peggy's paper the hidden pragmatist history of GNT, it is somewhat unclear whether by this Peggy means that pragmatism is one way to understand the philosophical underpinning of GNT, or it is the only way. My question is whether it is absolutely impossible for a non-anti-foundationalist theorist to nevertheless support GNT. Now, suppose there is a non-Western scholar who believes in the existence of God and thus the existence of an objective truth, and who at the same time is deeply troubled by the secularization of his or her society ushered in by radical Western-style modernization after a long period of colonization. In the post-colonial context, the most eminent problem in Deweyan sense this scholar is faced with is a distinctive way of life that has been imposed on him and his people, and he struggles to solve this problem in his distinctive modern context by reinterpreting his religious tradition and an objective truth it upholds in a way that can be appealing to a wide array of the people in his society. Can there be any way for this scholar to develop GNT despite his belief in the existence of objective moral truth? Can there be any way for GNT to be compatible with the religious reason? Second, at one point in her paper, Peggy cites Dewey's idea of, quote, the directive power of the concept of democracy, end of quote, thereby implicitly associating GNT with democracy. When she used the first falsifiability of deliberate democracy as a useful illustration of the pragmatist approach to GNT, I cannot help feeling that, like Dewey, Peggy seems to believe in the inextricable intertwinement between pragmatist and anti-foundationalism and democracy. For mainstream normative theories based in North America, there should be little question about the normative supremacy of democracy. In fact, very few political theories in North America tend to take non-democratic regime types seriously as an alternative ways to organize their public life. After all, however, democracy is only one particular type of political regime, and even some American liberal pluralists like Bill Garston caution against democratic dogmatism. In this connection, I am curious whether it is a part of Peggy's contention, albeit an implicit one, that there are certain inherent connections between anti-foundationalism and democracy, and by implication, between democracy and GNT. Can we conceive of GNT in a non-democratic context? For example, should we blame, or for instance, should we blame the advocates of political meritocracy for violating the basic normative condition of GNT? Okay, finally, for now, in my view, GNT's close attention to experience and rejection of the fact-value distinction seems to predispose it to the normative valorization of ordinary people who always place themselves within the circumstances of politics marked by value pluralism and moral disagreement. That is, one may even claim that GNT is a political theory that takes a perspective of ordinary people or marginalized people, as we will discuss today, as its baseline position. However, it is precisely because of the moral and epistemic limitations of ordinary people that some democratic and non-democratic political theories espouse epistemic democracy, which places far more emphasis on substance than procedure, or political meritocracy that either embrace only limited democratic elements, such as election, or attempts to go beyond the popular constraint of political elites in total. If GNT is predicated on the assumption of the high normative standing of the people, an assumption that is subject to ongoing debate among political theorists, how can a grounded normative theorist justify its moral assumption of the people in a pragmatist fashion? If this justification is also subject to moral disagreement and contestation, as stipulated by requirement of anti-foundationalism, where can we draw its normative force? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sungwoon. That's great. That's a super way of launching us off. And Peggy, thanks for being the launching voice. We'll turn to Peggy Cohn now to talk about Paul's paper.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, this paper is a tour de force. If you're curious about grounded and engaged theory and looking for inspiration, this is the paper to read. It explains why grounded theory matters, and it offers practical assistance to anyone who's thinking of designing a project that links theory and ethnography. And I think it's kind of difficult and challenging to do this type of research, especially for political theorists, in part because it hasn't been part of our training. And some of us are a little bit, introverted and sort of afraid of talking to people. And so to have a first foray into this research, it's very helpful to have a thoughtful guide like Paul. So Paul's paper makes it clear that grounding theory in empirical research is possible and worthwhile, because it is a way to harness the transformative power of critique in support of political action. So Paul's account of grounded theory is situated in the critical theory tradition of the Frankfurt School. And when I first looked at the title of his chapter, Grounding Critical Theory, I thought, of course, critical theory is a genre of grounded theory because it rejects ideal theory, focusing instead on cultural objects, historical change, and the structures of capitalism. drawing on Martin Jay's definition, I've always described critical theory as committed to both Marx and Freud, emancipation, and empirical social research. And I've been very excited to see the reemergence of a research program that combines these things. But Paul notes in his paper that the members of the Frankfurt School were not really interested in the views of the common people, or at least they didn't treat these views as a source of theoretical insight. Frankfurt School theorists, Paul tells us, never attempted to stage transformative interactions between academic social theory and the self-narrated experiences of people in oppressed groups outside of academic circles. Indeed, Adorno rejected the view that people are the best interpreters of their own experience. Instead, he and his collaborators drew on Marxism, Freudianism, as well as the view to inform the view that the motivations, people's own motivations remain opaque even to themselves. So I think the paper itself is like a really well written and very persuasive paper. And so I pose like not really critical questions, but really questions for further discussion that will help us better understand this line of this approach. So my first question is whether Adorno and McNay fit into the same tradition. For people who didn't have a chance to look at this paper, McNay is a scholar who is trying to update the critical theory approach to make it more open to the voices of everyday people. And so McNay's dialogical approach ends up sounding very similar to Dewey, with his emphasis on experimentalism, experience, and democracy. So I think Dewey would agree with McNay that knowledge is a cooperative endeavor, but the question is whether this fits very well into the traditional critical theory approach. So my first question is, how big a tent is critical theory to accommodate what seem to be, in many ways, almost opposing points of view? So I think one of the many strengths of this paper is the way it connects theoretical reflections on methodology and epistemology with practical advice to scholars who want to broaden their research practice. And I think there's 4 steps that are identified in the paper to do this, ways of grounding critical theory, which are very helpful for somebody who's trying to begin to do research in this area. The first one is co-creating field research instruments. The second is what Paul calls emergent theorizing, something like inductive approaches or iterative approaches that take seriously what you learn in the field in order to develop theory. The third is participating in community. And here the idea is not just like the formal participation that we think of in consultations, but rather volunteering in a way that really contributes to the community and its goals. And finally, 4, adapting one's theoretical approach to the intellectual culture of the people with whom one is conducting the project. And I think this piece very nicely explains what these steps entail. So for example, Paul explains that for item number 1, he engaged in collaboration with migrant rights organizations in order to formulate the field research instrument. So I would be very much interested in just learning more about the challenges faced in the research itself and how these principles were put into practice. So my second question is, what were some of these challenges and what advice do you have based on your experience of addressing them? So as one example, you mentioned the experience of volunteering, but at least at University of Toronto, it's very difficult to get clearance from the ethics protocol for any kind of research that doesn't involve free, prior, and informed consent. And so I was wondering just practically, whether you were able to draw on what you saw and experienced and learned in the more informal volunteering component of the research, and how you were able to integrate that. And then also the final item number 4 about adapting one's theoretical approach to the intellectual culture of the people. I would like to know more about what that entailed, because it's a challenge I've also faced in my own research on mixed income housing cooperatives, when I came to understand that concepts that I was introducing in questions were perceived very differently based on people's backgrounds. So one of the key distinctions in the paper is that between empirics and grounded and engaged theory, because the latter is solidaristic and not neutral. And I think this is very important for understanding this approach. But my third question is, what does this mean in practical terms from the perspective of the obligations of the researcher? So what I have in mind here is the following. What if collaborative research generates conclusions that could actually undermine the struggle of a partner organization, and then they don't want it to be publicized for that reason? Or what if the non-academic partners have very different interpretations than that of the researcher, and the researcher doesn't endorse the interpretations of the participants? So, for example, one could imagine going to, let's say, a worker center focused on like white workers in Appalachia who blame immigrants on their poor working conditions. And there's a little hint of this possibility even in this paper, in the discussion of the Inland Empire and the fact that workers and also their unions often supported the expansion of Amazon warehouses. And while this paper didn't kind of dig into that in any great depth, I kind of understood that maybe Paul himself disagreed with that as an assessment. And so I was wondering how the scholar addresses that. So I guess the final question that I wanted to raise sort of builds on this point about the role of the researcher. And the question is whether there's space for a form of grounded critical theory that is not solidaristic. And by that, I mean a type of study that's more oriented towards the negative side of critique, kind of like Adorno's study of the authoritarian personality to try and understand fascism. And I'm thinking here of more updated versions of that, like Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land. I would describe that as a project that is still oriented towards emancipation, and it's very grounded in the study of non-academic reflections on the operation of power, but it's not aiming to benefit the group that is being studied per se. Now, I anticipate the answer to that question would be like, yes, of course, there's a big tent pluralism, we can do different kinds of studies, but I guess in thinking about the possibility of that sort of negative critique side, I find myself wondering like how we even know like who we should be allied with, and how that can also shift during the research process. So again, just to wrap up, I think this is absolutely a foundational paper that will help people who are interested in this research to begin to take the risk of exploring it. I think there's so much to learn from ethnography, and we see that in this paper. But there are, I think, questions about the positionality of the researcher that I think we still need to dig more deeply into. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Excellent. So already we have a lot to work with, but we're going to keep going. So Paul.
Thanks, Brooke. I just want to begin by thanking all the panelists and Brooke, especially for your leadership in bringing discussions of grounded and engaged theory to the forefront of political theory today. You've done a lot, so much to do this, and we just really appreciate it. Now to the paper. So Brooke's main objective in this contribution to the volume is to discuss three key ways that feminist theory has driven the development of grounded and engaged normative theory. So first, for Brooke, feminist theorists have introduced alternative historiographies that foreground women's experiences and interrogate legal, political, economic, and cultural systems that both buttress and are shaped by gender hierarchies. Brooke argues that in part, feminist theory has facilitated progress in grounded normative theory by expanding the domain that defines whose experiences need to be taken into account when theorizing about justice or equality or other values. Feminist writers have also enriched substantive accounts of political and social history with just more material about the lives, struggles, and sufferings of women in many different parts of the world. And such contributions of feminist theory, she notes, have been distinguished by a determination to bring attention to, quote, intersectional hierarchies and power dynamics, and they've taken root in a broad range of disciplines. Second, for Brooke, feminist inquiry has further enabled grounded and engaged normative theory by incubating new methods of research, often in the context of intense political struggles over what counts as methodologically legitimate. Such methods are meant to make normative theorizing, she writes, quote, more accountable to the epistemic perspectives of those who have experiences that are marginalized by dominant perspectives. Now, among the novel approaches that Brooke mentions are, quote, interviewing as consciousness raising, methodologies for displacing one's perspective, centering experience in pedagogy, and interpretation of literature and culture as normative theory. Feminist theory's methodological initiatives have also prioritized recursivity in interpretive practices, such that theorists reflect constantly on how their own ideas and activities might be reproducing epistemic oppression. And in addition, Brooke wants us to recognize, again, in terms of methods, recognize feminist theorists' contributions in developing models of engaged research in the sense of, quote, research in partnership with organizations and activists. Third, for Brooke, feminist theorists' ethos of recursivity has encouraged a more general kind of humility about methodological commitments and has spurred supplementary practices that enhance the epistemic accountability of such theory. I think what she's saying here is that this disposition involves a willingness to subject even critically derived feminist methods to still further critical reflection, to avoid letting any as she puts it, any justificatory scheme for our normative claims, and to avoid letting such a scheme end up introducing a new system of epistemic power. Now, to shift to my comments on the paper, I find this last idea particularly important. And the practice that Brooke recommends, I think, has affinities with a critical pedagogical move that Paulo Freire makes when he elaborates his theory of popular education. So this is the idea that in the process of popular educational dialogues, participants not only construct both their interpretations of social reality and their method of mutual teaching and learning, they also must continually revisit and refashion the pedagogy itself. So I think there's something that you want to make a similar move in the third part of your paper there. And I think that's an important aspect of the paper. That said, my first item of critical feedback is to suggest that Brooke might further fill out her argument in this regard. Because Brooke, I'm not quite sure what practices you want to propose in the final section of the essay that go beyond the activities that you've already discussed in the second section on methodologies. So like to ensure epistemic accountability, is the idea that we should keep reapplying the procedures that make our knowledge of situations of oppression more comprehensive, that enact recursivity, and to develop research in collaboration with activists and non-academic organizations? Or are you thinking of advising an additional practice in this regard? If you're thinking along the latter lines, I wonder if it would help to elaborate on the promising notion of friction that you borrow from Jose Medina, and that you associate with the method of interviewing as consciousness raising formulated by Anne Bristow and Jody Esper. So that question of mine relates to another general suggestion I have, which is just to explain more precisely what you mean when you cite a certain methodological tactic that constitutes a feminist contribution to grounded and engaged theory. So for example, readers, this reader or one, might want to know more about how to conduct interviews so that they actually raise the political consciousness of participants rather than just being mechanisms of data collection, right? How might the consciousness raising features of interviews depend on the process for constructing interview protocols, or the open-endedness of the interview format, or whether the interviews are individual or involve multiple participants, or how the transcripts and interpretations are made available to community members? I'm personally drawn to these questions because in my studies with migrant workers, I've experimented with several different approaches to this challenge, and we can talk more about that later if you and others would like. But similarly, I'd be curious to learn how Maria Lugonis's methodologies for displacing one's perspectives work, and how you read bell hooks in terms of the idea of centering experience in pedagogy. So what I appreciate about this essay is how ecumenical and diverse Brooke's spectrum of grounded and engaged theoretical practices is, but I'd also like to see more detail about what those practices are and how they function. I'd also favor your offering more judgments about which among these varied practices you think are more crucial than the others, even if each has a role to play, and also how distinct methodological strategies might relate to one another. I see a bit of slippage in this regard when you begin the section on history by writing, quote, feminist theorists have brought lived experience into their political theory. But then right away you cite criticisms of patriarchal laws and economic systems by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and John Stuart Mill. Then you mention physician and psychiatrist Nawal Saadawi's interview of an imprisoned Egyptian sex worker. Now, I think the latter illustrates a way to infuse political theory with lived experiences, and that's what interviews are so good at revealing, as are, say, private letters, like the ones that Stanton wrote to Anthony about how housework and childcare had depleted her energy for activism. But rather than generically characterizing the grounding created for theory through all kinds of empirical research as all being lived experience, maybe we should distinguish between critiques of power structures and accounts of people's lived experiences of those power formations. And then maybe you would also agree that we ought to consider how to foster then a dynamic relation between these elements within theory's grounding. So that's what I have on Brooke. And a belated thanks to Peggy for your comments on my paper.
Thank you, Paul. That's really appreciated. I appreciate all of you, actually. I really appreciate Sun Moon being up late. Apparently for him, this hour is not late, but for me, this hour, if I were up at his hour, it'd be horribly late. Morning, it's not so bad for me. I really appreciate y'all coming together and being the volunteers to do our first webinar related to the handbook. And you know, Paul, your comments come a lot out of your own scholarship, and I have the good fortune of reading Sun Moon's paper contribution for this webinar, and it also comes deeply out of his own scholarship in this area. And so I will be brief, but I think it's because any depth on certain things that somebody who's unfamiliar with Sun Moon's work might have asked for, he does in his own scholarship. So he generously takes the opportunity of the handbook to almost do a sociology of the field of Confucian political thought, and he gives us this nice history of it, and then he situates his own work within that that sociology and the epistemic frameworks that it brought with us. Sun Moon Kim does a helpful job of situating his call and practice of grounded normative East Asian thought in the politics and sociology of East Asian societies generally, and in Korea specifically, while others engage in the philosophical enterprise of renovating Confucian thought for contemporary societies. And he reviews a lot of that work in the contribution. He argues that they pursue this as a relatively unengaged philosophical enterprise, missing the one, pluralism of contemporary societies, two, historical pluralism of the philosophical enterprises that influence Confucianism throughout its history of political influence, whether it's been in favor or out of favor. And three, the sociology of the cultures where their theories are supposed to apply. He then concludes with a set of empirical inquiries. So to quote from his own opening, then it shows how, this paper shows how to redirect normative Confucian political theory toward a grounded and engaged political theory that can effectively address the problems faced by the East Asian people. So he adds to the contributions we've already heard that call to matter to the people who we are theorizing about or with. So address the problems faced by the East Asian people, many of which stem from the tension between their often unwitting subscription to the Confucian way of life and liberal democratic rights, principles, and institutions transplanted from the West. This chapter concludes that though normative Confucian political theory does not have to be democratic theory, its guiding methodology must derive from and be acceptable to the perspectives of the people who are subject to its normative stipulations. This is a great contribution to the volume, which achieves way more than one handbook piece should be able to achieve in 5,000 words. Those of us who just need a lesson in brevity can turn to this piece for that as well. He outlines a problem, thus giving G&T a why in this piece. He shows what attending to the empirical situation, the sociology faced by Asian peoples entails, the tension between their often unwitting subscription to the Confucian way of life and liberal democratic rights, principles, and institutions transplanted in the West, what that tension can provide, or rather for what facing that sociology can provide for asking the right question for political theory. And then he concludes with a methodological reflection on what the theory entails. This last draws on his own scholarship, as I mentioned before, and includes a historical accounting. I'd like to give a little personal color to that first piece about the unwittingness. I mean, I've been with Sun Moon in a palace, a Confucian palace in South Korea, with all sorts of architectural reminders of the philosophical, intellectual, and political history of the place. having an argument with a fellow Confucian scholar about how Confucian Korea is. So he just sort of turned around and said, how can you deny this? And I think that I want to make sure that we appreciate the profound nature of the tension in people's lived lives, whether it's, again, that word unwitting he uses, whether it's visible or invisible in their daily lives. And so it's quite a challenge that that Sung Moon has taken up in each of his last 2 books, which I highly recommend. So I'm going to end with 3 questions so that we can move on to a group discussion. The first gets to that colonial construction, the context of interaction with the West. So when you're writing about the West, well, as a comparison, you say, East Asia didn't have wars of religion. But what is at work in the Confucian context is the engagement with philosophical ideas from around the world, and not just within East Asia, but certainly range of views within East Asia. And one of the challenges for Confucian thought has been that it's been engaged with a colonial enterprise of Europeans and their effort to characterize Confucianism as a religion. So does that history and that characterization from the outside, if you will, does that come inside? And does it influence how the Western trained and Western engaged Confucian academics reflect on the meaning of Confucianism and the importance of doing Confucian political philosophy in a grounded and engaged way? My second question is about the in favor and out of favor that Confucianism enjoyed throughout East Asian histories. And probably I should add to that differences across countries, but I'll let you decide whether you want to pick that out. So throughout the history of East Asian societies, the political theories associated with different flavors of Confucianism have been in and out of favor politically, and therefore variously influenced. Is this history relevant to your G&T of Confucian thought today, or can we do G&T right in the middle of where we are, and we don't need history? How historically grounded does a G&T need to be? It's a question I want to ask of myself, but your contribution made me think about that. And then third, what is generalizable from such a G&T, or does it then become the political science of Korea if we can't generalize outside of Korea? Korea is the case that he generally focuses on in the paper. In other words, how generalizable is G&T? So thank you, each of you, for your contributions. I see no questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to go right back around and start with Sung Moon. If you want to address your queries, or if you want to pick up any threads you see among us, and we'll just go down the line, and then that'll give everybody a little chance to formulate their own questions and comments.
Great. Thank you, Brooke, for your very constructive reading of my short essay. Okay, let me start with your first question. Colonial construction or enterprise of European reconstruction of Confucianism as kind of religion, how does that affect the Western understanding or approach to Confucianism or normative Confucianism? I think this is at the heart of the enterprise that is unfolding at the moment, because many liberal critics of normative Confucian political theory finds fault with the whole enterprise for being perfectionist. Because why you call your theory of democracy Confucian democracy, right? In the first place, that privileged Confucianism over other comprehensive doctrines in the first place, that disqualifies your theory as pluralist and whatever or pragmatist democratic theory, right? Because the problem arises because many people outside this tradition or within those who are within this tradition tend to understand Confucian as kind of a religious doctrine or a set of religious doctrine, just like roles under the comprehensive doctrine in a pretty dogmatic, doctrinaire, doctrine-based, denomination-based religion, right? So if you understand Confucian, from very different angle, paying more close attention to its practical dimension, its ethical dimension rather than religious dimension, then the very understanding of Confucianism is widely, dramatically different, so that your normative enterprise would be characteristically, distinguishably different from the way liberal, critic approach by taking Confucian as kind of religious doctrine, something like that. In favor and out of favor. Well, I think it's relevant to grounded normative Confucian political theory because Confucianism has been identified as the single greatest obstacle to East Asian, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and arguably Japanese, but mainly Korean, Chinese modernization, right? As if there is only one social, religious, cultural practice that was there in pre-modern East Asian societies, right? But there is a variety of reasons why Confucianism was singled out as the single greatest problem, because Confucianism influenced significantly, substantially on the way Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese society were constructed in terms of its legal, political, social structures. Of course, in terms of religion, social practice, other religious, shamanism, Taoism, other, even Christianity, Catholicism influenced the way East Asians conduct their way of their life as private individuals or members of certain organizations. But still, as far as the law and political institutions are concerned, still it was Confucian, and that's why Confucian. So I think it's extremely important for East Asians to revisit what kind of, again, while we are thinking about adultery, LGBT questions, social movement, social justice, we are still deeply embedded in certain way of thinking, which I identify with reference to Confucianism. But still, we don't have a language that can make sense of the way we tend to think about important public and moral questions. So displacement Confucianism should be revisited in order to give it an opportunity as a tradition to speak for itself, and then people like myself and others who are equipped to the certain languages in both the Western political theory and East Asian political theory to create more comprehensible, intelligible language for East Asian people to grapple with is extremely, I think, important. Generalization, again, one of my small contributions to normative Confucian political theory is the idea or theory of public vision Confucianism. Public vision doesn't have to be value neutral, kind of a Rollsian, Kantian or Hobbesian, Rollsian neutral apparatus. Public vision can be embedded in the way people think about important public moral matters with reference to their inherited social, cultural values. So if that can be theorized, I think we can think about different kinds of public vision, even different kinds of Confucian public vision when you're studying Taiwanese society, mainland Chinese society, Korean society, or even South Korean and North Korean societies, Japanese society. So we can develop very interesting philosophical framework to make our theoretical enterprise much more diverse and interesting, even if we would acknowledge that we're grounding our theory in Confucian tradition broadly understood. Okay, thank you.
So I think what I'll do is go to Peggy, but as I go to Peggy, I'm going to mention two questions that are in the Q&A. One from David Owen about methods. Are surveys or conjoint experiments okay? What kind of empirics are okay? And I think Peggy, Paul, maybe I can also answer some of that or address that if we're so inclined. And then Adriana Petri doubles down on the question I asked of Sungmoon, and we might ask it of all the panelists: how historically grounded does it need to be? How grounded in religious practices or the diverse cultural categories, given the vernacular that grounded normative theory is often bringing up. So Peggy, to you.
Okay, I'll try and be really brief. So thank you, Sungmoon, for your comments. I hope you could send them to me if you wrote them up, because you did freeze a few times, and I'm afraid I might have missed some of it. But the first point, or the first question, whether pragmatism is the only way that you can have this anti-foundationalist argument, I would say it certainly isn't. I think that post-colonial theory, like Frantz Fanon, feminist theory, with the critique of, or the embrace of situated knowledge, I think are important sources and justifications of methods of grounded normative theory. However, in trying to really dig deeply into reconstructing the philosophical arguments, I found this to be a particularly rich source of ideas and arguments. There's just this incredible anguish about the loss of I think, like a theological worldview and a really in-depth conversation about alternatives. And so that's why I found this interesting to draw on. But I think it's definitely only one of multiple sources. As far as the relationship between GNT and democracy, and more generally situating it in the context of maybe also East Asian traditions and global traditions, I just want to thank you very much for posing that question, because this is, I think, something that I really didn't take into account, despite like being interested in working on post-colonial issues elsewhere. And so it just reminds me of how right it is that we have this horizon of meaning and interpretation that we're embedded in when we pose questions. And I absolutely replicated that in this paper. And that's why it's so important to do this kind of work, where we're in conversation with people who aren't in that frame and pose new questions and give us new transformative perspectives. So I think it's not something which is intrinsically connected to democracy. To the contrary, I would give as an example Saba Mahmood's book on the politics of piety, where she was interviewing very pious women in Egypt and using what she learned from them to challenge ideas of autonomy and even post-structuralist traditions. And so I would put that in grounded normative theory. So while in the context of pragmatism, it was very much about, this is not a scholarly practice that is done in academia through researchers, but like in community organizations. And so they saw it as part of the diffusion of a democratic way of life, that these conversations would be happening between people with different perspectives and different like theoretical tools. That's something that hasn't really come out maybe that much, to some degree, of course, in Paul's work and Paulo Freire. But I think that that is something that's worth thinking about, is like, what sites can this happen like organically, so that it's not just about like knowledge translation that's carried out by academics. Yes, as far as the question of, is this really focused on the experience of like ordinary people? I realized that I sort of took that for granted when I was first reading the work of Brooke and others as they were first generating this concept. But really, I see this developing in at least 3 different strands, right? There's sort of grounded theory, there's engaged theory, which is not the same thing, and then there's normative theory. All of them and are struggling to think about how they fit together. And so I think that there may be sub-traditions within it, but that's generative for a research tradition as it emerges. But I would be interested if Brooke thinks like that that's okay, that you could be like grounded and normative without being engaged in exactly that way, or you could be grounded and engaged without being normative. So that's it for now.
Excellent. And Paul, I just want to remind you of David Owen's question about methods and Adriana's question about historical and contextualization in light of our focus on the vernacular sometimes. Thank you, Peggy.
Yeah, I have a bit to say about both those questions in the chat. But first, Peggy, thanks a lot for your questions and comments about my paper. You and I can argue about Adorno separately, and whether Adorno and Lois are part of the same crew. I just, I think the way I start the paper by phrasing the issue in terms of thought not being adequate to itself and not assuming that it's adequate to itself is a sort of core point of alliance between those two critical theoretical perspectives, as I see it. Thought needing to go outside itself. When Adorno talks about suffering physicality, and McNay talks about the direct experience of groups and people who've suffered oppression, I think there is a way that those things harmonize with one another, even though obviously there are really different approaches involved in decades of difference. So, in terms of the practice, I'm glad you found value in the practical steps towards doing grounded critical theory, or critical popular research, as they call it in my paper. Just a comment. You said, have I run into any challenges in doing the research, and mentioned the sort of daunting quality sometimes that people run into of IRB processes, where you have to get field work approved by your institutional body that governs those kinds of work, and make sure that you're doing it ethically. I actually think that the principle behind IRBs, or here it's called the Research Ethics Board at LSE, is like right on. Like, we really have to be thinking about these issues when we're doing research in the field, especially with vulnerable groups and people. And different institutions have varying levels, I know, of stickiness of those processes. So you have to deal with whatever hand you're dealt in that regard. But I don't think that I would just encourage, sometimes I sense a kind of initial phobia among theorists of like, oh my God, I couldn't possibly engage the IRB. That's for psychologists, and maybe anthropologists, but it doesn't have to be that bad. And if you're having trouble with your IRB, talk to colleagues who are doing well with theirs. And you asked too about this really interesting question about, so if you're doing collaborative research with another organization and you come up with conclusions that are at odds with something that they believe in or that are critical of something that they're doing, I mean, that's always been a real challenge, I have to say. And I think the way that I've dealt with it is to kind of be honest with myself as I'm going through the process of my own interpretations, over the years it takes to write a book. And I'm like, okay, I think I'm seeing an issue here or a problem here. And then you have to finesse, like, how are you going to write about it in the published book? And how are you going to talk about it with them when you are, discussing things privately? I think it's okay for, you not to like air all the dirty laundry about your organizational partner in the published writings that you have, and to keep certain things, more for more casual, informal conversations. So, but it is an issue. I mean, I am saying that, and when I talk about volunteering, I'm in favor of doing research where you are explicitly, actively aligned politically and working for the organization, doing work with, the organization about which you're writing. So you're really not taking the detached observer perspective there, and you're invested in the fight. And so you want them to succeed. So, yeah, it's an issue. You're right to draw attention to it, but I think there are ways to work with it, and that we're not reduced to either like total honesty or total dishonesty one way or the other. David's question is really interesting. I write about this in the paper, I think, a little bit, by saying that I really do think that there are lots of different approaches to grounded critical theory. I was pressed on this by Jody Dean at a conference that we do together on critical theory this past summer. She's like, so are you saying that everybody needs to do this kind of dialogical, interactive ethnographic work that you're doing? She didn't think so. And so it really sort of forced me to kind of decide where I threw my chips. And the way I end up putting it in the paper, which again, all these papers are in draft form now, so comments and feedback most welcome. The way I put it in the paper is that I think that there really ought to be a central place within critical theory for engagement with people who take ethnographic work as a fundamental element of what they're doing. Absolutely, not everybody needs to be doing that kind of work. People should do what they feel really good at and what they're drawn to and what their circumstances, bring them to. So David mentions, for example, what if you're interested in doing survey research? That's not the same thing as getting direct lived experience in the sense that Lois McNay is talking about, or that I'm talking about when I am, working with Paulo Freire's work. But it's a really important way of grounding political theory empirically. It's just that I think if you don't have, Lois's point is that if you're not at some point really trying to speak to and with and act together with oppressed groups of people, then you're sort of letting go one of the important qualities that distinguishes critical theory from other forms of theory.
Oh, great. I love this discussion. Let's see. So I might, again, really thank Paul for his questions, and see if I can address them by starting with David and Adriana, or Ariadna. Sorry, I've been pronouncing your name wrong. So empirics. Can you use these other methods? In my view, yes, and they'll be even better if we recognize that all quantitative data is qualitative data first, and if we pay attention to the sociology of that quantitative data. So in my work, I do often use sources that result in a huge quantity of data. And often that is really hard to interpret or easy to misinterpret without a qualitative component. So this climate book that I'm working on has household surveys in 26 communities that resulted in some pretty vague findings that were really easy to interpret once I had ethnographies in half of those, once I had a really clear understanding of how hierarchy was working in those places. So to answer one of Paul's questions about recursivity, yes, I will say if there's a spectrum in GNT that is how ecumenical you are, I'm going to be on the ecumenical side. I think this field is developing. I think we want to use all the methods that certainly the political science has developed, but a lot of our skill set is coming out of anthropology. Notice we weren't anthropologists from the beginning. We joined anthropology in its more critical mode, right? We didn't join anthropology in its more colonial mode. And likewise, grounded normative theory, to the extent it echoes grounded theory, it's also coming out of some normative reflections about what grounded theory can reveal. So I will acknowledge that yes, I'm quite ecumenical on the methods, and I am shy, reserved anyway, to Paul's question about making judgments. I much prefer to think about an argument, which I'm happy to be, pretty confident in if I'm actually confident in it, but then to be clear in the argument where the wiggle room around the argument is, where I see the next line of research, the next set of questions, what voices aren't heard and reflected in this argument. So I think of friction as a sometimes useful element of recursivity. It could also maybe enhance our comprehensiveness. Friction from Medina, just for the audience, is where you intentionally put yourself in conversation with somebody whose views are not like yours. So it's one method of doing, one of the questions that came up earlier. But I do not think friction is at all a sufficient methodology for being even able to understand what your friction is teaching you, right? It just takes more, to me anyway. Maybe I just really like a lot of data to understand what I'm perceiving. And it is true, my work takes a long time, so maybe I just really need to sit in it and compost in it. And then on that history piece, so I'm going to tie that also to the boundaries of recursivity. So I think one of the problems with the commitment to recursivity is if we don't recognize that it's not a commitment on its own, that it entails also accountability to those who've contributed to our insights. And if we attend to that accountability, we can't just keep asking questions and gathering more data and going on and on and on. We owe them, whether we like their views or not, we owe them getting them out. To the point about respectfulness, as I mentioned in my last book, I took a good, I think, 4 years, 2014, when I originally had this one piece of the argument that relied on telling what was happening to certain activists, and they asked that we not use them. That I not use them in the book because they were experiencing what they perceived as political threat. It then went to the other side. They were threatened, somebody was killed, and so they said, actually, we would like you to get our story out. And we're getting our story out anyway, so it's not a problem. That's not, I think, the question that was raised. I think the question was raised was, what if we ethically disagree with our informants? I am not as embedded in relationship with the places I work as, well, that's not true. I am embedded in relationship, but not in the same way that Paul is. And so my questions aren't really their questions. So I generally am asking their empirical question for them, and then I'm using what I learn by asking their normative question for their empirical normative question for them to do my own normative theorizing. And so that, I think, puts me in a slightly different position to where I've just, the structure of my theory isn't in opposition to anybody else's theory. It's more not at a level of remove. It's just a different construct. I'm not using the architecture, not necessarily using the architectures they have. I want to make sure that we get further into the chat. So Peggy, did you get a chance to look at Marin's question?
Yes, I did. Thank you very much for that question. I really want to look back on my use of partial distance because I really don't think that really captures that well how I see James's approach. I see it more as like fusion of horizons. So you have this way in which like questions are structured, and then is of understanding these questions or answering them, you revise your views. And so it's not like a total rejection, but a kind of reconstruction in light of this like new information. So that's how I understand James's view, and so I should check that. I do think James is quite different though from Dewey and Adams, because they are more part of, as you described it, like an activist ethos. James very much wasn't. I think he was very interested in like epistemological issues, not so much in like the democratic like reconstruction of the public. And so I think that a paper on this topic would also do well to engage Adams in more depth, because she's the one who's actually creating like an institution where these types of like interactions are happening organically. And so the feature of the paper that I think is important to foreground, and is a controversial dimension of it, frankly, that I expected people to pick up on more or criticize more, is this kind of evolutionary dimension of Dewey's thought, and his view that there is a certain amount of change that's possible in order to ensure groups flourish, and that there is a sort of almost like left sociobiology that in a way like guarantees that we'll be able to solve conflicts and like reconstruct social harmony in some ways. And that's also like a feature of the approach that to us today kind of seems discordant, but I think is important in understanding how they thought like moral progress would continue to happen, even in the absence of any moral foundations.
That's super. We are 3 minutes to when I committed to our stopping. And so I want to first see if any of my panelists have anything else that they would like to raise to close us out. Okay. Oh, you do. Good, Paul. So here's my plan. Then Paul's going to say, we'll close it out. And then there are a couple of questions that we are not going to have time to talk about. And so I thought if once we close out, if you would like to stay on, we can elevate and have a little more casual conversation for another 15 minutes. But some of our panelists have to go. Go ahead, Paul.
I'm one of those who has to go, but I just wanted to acknowledge Jonathan's question. It's a really interesting one, and I have done a collaboration with a sociologist who did the leading study of day laborers in the United States. Just a simple empirical study, straightforward, of like what are the living and working conditions of day laborers like. It was descriptive, quantitative research, and the key challenge there that I'll mention is just his tendency to like defer to me on questions of theoretical interpretation in ways that I thought were unnecessary. And so it can be difficult to kind of overcome in your colleagues' dispositions a sort of sense that they should bow to your expertise in the realm of theory, rather than seeing theory as someone that in some sense we're all doing.
That's a nice point. When I've collaborated with a political scientist, it was on the operationalization of a variable. So the variable had been used for a question to mean something for a long time. And we asked, does it really mean that, or does it mean this other thing? What are people really saying when they answer that question? So I think the conversation can be really fruitful, as was our entire conversation today. There will be more such seminars, webinars coming out of the handbook the next batch will be more focused, or will give more concrete examples of methodology and practice. So we look forward to these further conversations and thank our panelists for joining us today. I appreciate you going first.
Thanks to everybody, and thanks to people who came.
Yeah, you've been a wonderful.
Thanks a lot.
Yes, I'd also like to thank Brooke for organizing it. It's been fantastic to be part of this. I've learned so much by participating in this project. So thank you.
Me too.